The night started like any other. Quiet, cold, and heavy, with the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world's holding its breath. I sat in the parking lot outside the company warehouse, the familiar buzz of fluorescent lights humming overhead. My hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee, not for the caffeine, but for the warmth. January nights like this seeped into your bones, no matter how many layers you wore. I glanced at the rearview mirror and caught my own eyes staring back. Tired, like always. Not exhausted, just worn down by a life that demanded too much. That's why this job appealed to me in the first place. It didn't demand anything beyond following the rules. I used to wonder why I'd been recruited. My old life wasn't anything special, a string of dead-end jobs and a few bad decisions I'd rather not revisit. But when the government comes knocking and offers you a paycheck that seems too good to be true, you don't ask questions. I learned that early. The name of the company, Universal Junk Solutions, was almost funny when you considered what we actually did. We didn't haul broken washing machines or yard debris. What we moved didn't belong in any landfill, at least not one on this planet. The rules kept it all simple. 7 rules, straightforward enough if you didn't let your curiosity get the better of you. Don't ask questions about the objects. Don't interact with the objects beyond what's required. Never load a container that isn't yours. Don't take anything home. If an object starts moving, leave it behind and report it. Avoid mirrors or reflective surfaces at job sites. Never speak to visitors. Those rules had been drilled into me during training, though no one ever explained why. I guess it didn't matter. They paid me well to shut up and do what I was told. It wasn't like I wanted to know, anyway. I finished my coffee and stepped out of the car, the air sharp enough to sting my nose. Inside the warehouse, the rest of the team was already assembling. A handful of us, enough to do the job, not enough to make small talk inevitable. Everyone here worked the same way, professional, detached, and careful to keep personal details out of reach. "Factory job tonight," Carter said as we crowded around the briefing table. He was the crew lead, tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice like gravel. "Abandoned site out in the woods. Same as always. Clear the place, pack the containers, stick to your assignments." He handed out clipboards with the job details. "This one's straightforward. No questions, no exceptions." I scanned the sheet. The address was a half-hour drive away, listed as a decommissioned industrial site. The words "isolated location" jumped out at me. Those were the worst ones, the kind of places where the silence felt alive. The rest of the team didn't seem fazed. Matteo yawned and stretched, while Erin double-checked her equipment with the precision of someone who probably had a military background. No one talked much, but that was normal. We'd worked together enough to understand that sharing too much could backfire in this line of work. We loaded up the truck. The routine so ingrained it felt automatic. Straps, gloves, and reinforced cases. Everything designed for the kind of cargo no one wanted to think about too hard. I climbed into the passenger seat, pulling my jacket tighter as Carter started the engine. The warehouse lights faded into the distance as we headed into the night. Trees lined the road, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I didn't mind the quiet, but something about this job already felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the shadows along the road seemed darker than usual, or how the cold seemed to creep through the truck's insulation, no matter how high the heater was cranked. Carter didn't say much, and I didn't either. Talking never made the jobs easier. Instead, I stared out the window and let the hum of the tires on the asphalt fill the silence. By the time we reached the factory, the unease I'd felt earlier had settled into my chest like a weight. The building loomed ahead, a hulking, rust-streaked structure with broken windows and a crumbling facade. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, though the scorch marks near the entrance suggested otherwise. The truck's headlights swept across the yard, illuminating twisted scraps of metal and debris scattered like forgotten relics. My stomach tightened as I stepped out into the night, the cold biting harder here than it had back at the warehouse. Carter killed the engine and turned to the team. "All right, you know the drill. Stick to the rules, and we'll be out of here before sunrise." The job had officially begun. The factory loomed ahead like a beast, crouched in the dark. The air around it felt heavier, almost suffocating, as though the building itself had drawn in the night. We parked the truck just outside the rusted gates, its headlights cutting into the overgrown yard. The ground was a patchwork of dirt and brittle weeds, and there, just beyond the gates, were scorch marks. Deep, blackened streaks fanned out in irregular patterns like something had burned its way into or out of the factory. Carter killed the engine, plunging us into silence, save for the crunch of boots on gravel as we climbed out. The cold bit deeper here, sharper and rawer than it had been back at the warehouse. "Let's move," Carter said, his voice low and clipped. We grabbed our gear from the truck, heavy-duty gloves, reinforced cases, and flashlights. My breath fogged the air as I adjusted my headlamp, its beam cutting through the darkness in sharp, clinical swaths. The factory's front doors hung ajar, one of them listing awkwardly on its hinges. Carter shoved it open, the screech of metal on concrete echoing into the void. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of rust and mildew, though there was something else too, a faint, metallic tang I couldn't place. "This place reeks," Matteo muttered, his voice muffled by the scarf he'd pulled over his face. "Focus," Carter snapped, already stepping into the shadows. The main floor stretched out before us, a cavernous space littered with forgotten debris. Rusted beams arched overhead, their jagged edges dripping with years of corrosion. Most of the windows had been shattered, but the few remaining panes caught the moonlight, casting fractured reflections onto the concrete floor. I tried not to look too closely at those reflections. Rule 6 wasn't just a suggestion. "Stick to your assignments," Carter barked, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Ava, you're on Zone 3. Aaron, Zone 2. Matteo, you've got Zone 4. Let's clear this place and go home." We fanned out, the sound of our boots echoing as we moved deeper into the building. My zone was to the left, a cluster of rooms that had likely been offices once upon a time. The first room was empty save for a broken desk and a pile of papers fused to the floor by some long-dried liquid. The second room was worse. A pile of objects sat in the center, illuminated by my headlamp. I hesitated, the beam lingering on the heap. These weren't the usual oddities we handled. Among the junk was a set of gears, their edges jagged and uneven, as if they'd been torn from some ancient machine. They were far too large to fit anything that could have operated in this world. Beside them lay a cluster of smooth black stones, their surfaces gleaming unnaturally even in the dim light. But the real centerpiece was the box. It was small, no larger than a shoebox, and made of some kind of dark, unidentifiable metal. Faint lines etched its surface, glowing faintly with a rhythmic pulse. I stepped closer, the hum it emitted barely audible but somehow cutting through the quiet like a knife. "What even is this stuff?" Matteo's voice crackled through the radio, and I froze. "Don't ask questions," I snapped, my hand instinctively tightening on the radio. Rule 1. He should have known better. "Relax," Matteo replied, but I could hear the edge in his voice, like he wasn't sure if he was joking or trying to mask his own unease. I didn't reply. Instead, I crouched down and opened my case, pulling out the thick plastic sheeting we used to wrap items like these. My hands moved quickly, methodically, but my mind was racing. The hum of the box seemed to grow louder the closer I got to it, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I wrapped the box and secured it inside the case, but the hum didn't stop. I tried to shake off the unease and stood, scanning the rest of the room. The stones were next. As I crouched to gather them, a faint sound caught my ear. A soft click, almost like glass cracking under pressure. I turned sharply, the beam of my headlamp swinging across the room. It landed on a mirror propped against the far wall, its surface warped and shattered in places. The air around it felt wrong. I stepped back instinctively, my heart hammering in my chest. In the fractured surface of the mirror, something moved. Not me, not my reflection, but something else. It shifted, slow and deliberate, before freezing as my light landed on it. A wave of cold washed over me and I averted my gaze. Rule 6, I muttered under my breath, forcing myself to look at the floor instead of the mirror. I grabbed my radio and pressed the button. Stay away from any mirrors, don't ask, just do it. No one replied, but I heard Matteo's sharp intake of breath through the line. I didn't need to see him to know he'd seen something too. My hands were shaking as I finished securing the last of the items in the room. Whatever was in this factory, it didn't want us here. I was finishing up my zone when the radio crackled to life, Carter's gruff voice cutting through the static. Break time. Meet back at the entry point. Relief washed over me. My nerves were raw, and every shadow felt like it was watching me. I stowed my gear and made my way back to the factory's entrance, where the others were already gathering. Erin leaned against the wall, her usual stoic demeanor giving way to the faintest edge of tension. Carter was pacing, checking his clipboard, while Mateo sat on an overturned crate, cradling something in his lap. The box. My heart dropped. Mateo, tell me you didn't. He glanced up, his face pale but defiant. I just wanted to see what was inside. You're telling me you're not the least bit curious? Curious enough to lose your job? Or worse? I snapped, moving toward him. You know the rules, shut it and hand it over. But it was too late. The lid was already off. The thing inside wasn't mechanical. It wasn't anything I could describe with certainty. Organic, maybe, but not alive in any way I understood. It glowed faintly, a swirling mass of translucent fleshy tendrils that pulsed with a faint, melodic hum. The sound was strange, almost soothing, but it made my stomach churn, like hearing a song I wasn't supposed to know. Erin pushed off the wall and marched over, snatching the box out of Mateo's hands. What the hell is wrong with you? She hissed, slamming the lid shut. Relax, Mateo said, holding up his hands. Nothing happened. Not yet, Carter growled, stepping between them. You're done for the night, Mateo. Stay by the truck. If I catch you near the equipment again, you're walking home. Mateo muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue. He stood and brushed past me, his shoulders tense. That's when I noticed it. His shadow didn't move right. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the shape trailing behind him was wrong, stretched too long and shifting, almost like it had its own rhythm. I didn't say anything. Not yet. The tension hung in the air as we stood in silence, the hum from the box seemingly etched into my ears, even though it was closed. Carter's voice cut through the quiet. Back to work. We finish this job and we leave. But none of us moved. That's when Erin pointed toward the broken windows. Do you see that? She asked, her voice low but sharp. At first I didn't. Just darkness beyond the shattered glass. But then they flickered into view. Figures. Humanoid but wrong in every way. Their limbs were too long, bending in impossible angles. Their eyes glowed faintly, pale and cold, and their movements were jittery, as if they were being dragged across the ground by unseen strings. They flickered in and out of view, like static on an old TV, each shift accompanied by a faint, warbling distortion in the air. I instinctively stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. What the hell are those? Erin whispered, gripping the box tighter. No idea, Carter said, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. But we're sticking to protocol. Don't interact, don't talk, and don't break the goddamn rules again. Mateo laughed nervously. You're acting like they're gonna waltz in here and say hello. They're probably just some kind of hallucination. It's this place. It's messing with us. Hallucinations don't cast shadows, I said, pointing. One of the figures stepped closer, its flickering form casting a long, jagged shadow across the ground. It stretched far too long for something its size, twisting and writhing as if alive. Mateo's bravado faltered. This isn't real, he muttered, his voice shaking. It's not real. It's real enough, Carter said, and if you want to make it out of here, you'll listen to me. We follow the rules. No more mistakes. But Mateo wasn't listening. His breathing quickened, and his eyes darted between the figures, which were slowly, methodically, drawing closer. They're watching me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can feel it. They're here because of me. Mateo, pull it together, Erin said, her tone sharp. He shook his head, backing away from us. No, this isn't right. We never should have opened that box. They know, and they're here for me. I reached out to him, but he flinched, his gaze fixed on the figures outside. We need to finish the job, Carter said firmly, as if sheer authority could anchor us. But even he seemed rattled, his eyes flicking to the windows every few seconds. The figures weren't moving like humans. They would jerk forward, then pause, their heads tilting unnaturally as if listening. The glow in their eyes pulsed faintly, in perfect sync with the hum I couldn't stop hearing. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my heart pounding in my ears. The rules were supposed to keep us safe, but right now safety felt like a distant memory. Stick to the plan, I said, more to myself than anyone else. But deep down, I wasn't sure the plan would be enough anymore. The first of the figures crossed the factory's threshold with an eerie grace, its movements unnatural and stuttered, like a video buffering on a weak signal. Its form was more distinct now, stepping into the dim light of our headlamps. The body was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs that bent at unsettling angles. Its skin, or what passed for it, shifted constantly, a swirling interplay of darkness and faint light that seemed to bleed into the air around it. And then there was the sound. A low-frequency hum, almost subsonic, resonated from the thing as it moved closer. I felt it more than heard it, like a vibration deep in my chest, a physical pressure that made my pulse quicken. Matteo predictably broke first. "What do you want?" he yelled, stepping toward it despite Carter's sharp, "Stand down!" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, an unnatural motion that seemed to fold its neck in on itself before snapping back into place. "Matteo, don't," I hissed, my voice low and urgent. Rule number 7 screamed in my head like a siren, never speak to visitors. But he didn't listen. Matteo raised his arms, his movements frantic. "If this is about the box, take it." I didn't mean to. The figure moved. It didn't walk or lunge. It just shifted, like it was skipping frames of a film, and suddenly it was right in front of Matteo. We all froze. The visitor didn't attack, didn't reach for him. Instead, it began to mimic him, raising its long, distorted arms in the same frantic gestures. Its limbs didn't move like his. They jerked and twitched, delayed by half a second, like a warped reflection in a broken mirror. "Stop!" Matteo screamed, backing away. The visitor mirrored the movement, stepping back in its glitching rhythm. I said stop. Matteo lunged forward and the figure followed, its arms twitching out as if to grab something that wasn't there. "Matteo, shut up!" Carter barked, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. The visitor stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on Matteo, unblinking. It tilted its head again, emitting a higher-pitched hum that sent a shiver down my spine. And then there were more. I don't know how they got inside. One moment, they were beyond the windows, faintly visible in the shattered glass. The next, they were inside the factory, slipping through gaps in the walls and stepping out of shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hold them. 5. No, 6. They moved in sync, their hums layering over each other in a discordant chorus. The air felt denser, harder to breathe. "They're surrounding us," Erin whispered, her knuckles white as she clutched the box to her chest. "They're drawn to it," Carter said, his voice low but steady. He looked at Erin, then at the rest of us. "We need to finish the job, get these things loaded and get the hell out of here." "What job?" Matteo snapped, his voice cracking. "We're not making it out of here." Carter ignored him, his jaw tightening. "Ava, start loading. Matteo, stay by the truck." But I wasn't listening anymore. Something had clicked in my head, a vague memory from my training, the part they never explained but always emphasized. Some objects, the instructor had said, are not meant to be disturbed. If activated, they may draw attention. Do not ask from what. I turned to Erin. "The box. We have to seal it, or destroy it." Erin shook her head. "Destroy it with what? And you really think sealing it's gonna make a difference now?" I didn't have an answer. The hum from the visitors was growing louder, vibrating the very walls of the factory. I needed to think. To act. My headlamp flickered, and for a second, my beam landed on a door at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of debris. "I'll be right back," I said, my voice tight. "What are you doing?" Carter demanded, but I was already moving, weaving through the scattered junk toward the door. It was sealed with a heavy lock, but the hinges were so rusted that a few solid kicks sent it clattering to the ground. The room beyond was small, more of a storage closet than anything else. But it was what was inside that stopped me cold. Stacks of file boxes lined the walls, their edges yellowed with age. Military insignias were stamped on some of them, alongside words like classified and top secret. I grabbed the nearest folder and flipped it open, my hands trembling. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white images of objects like the ones we'd been hauling for months. Strange, alien things that didn't belong in this world. Notes accompanied the photos, dense with technical jargon I didn't fully understand, but certain phrases leapt out at me. Extraterrestrial origin. Containment protocols. Potentially hostile entities. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages. This wasn't junk. None of it was. These were artifacts, remnants of something not from here. And we'd been cleaning them up like old furniture, moving them to God knows where. The hum in the factory reached a fever pitch, shaking the walls. I shoved the folder back into the box and ran toward the door. Whatever we'd done tonight, we'd broken something. And now the visitors were here to fix it. Or to make sure we didn't. I didn't know what to do. The room felt smaller the longer I stood there, the air thick with the hum of the visitors pressing in from every corner. I could feel their presence, even though I couldn't see them, an oppressive weight on my chest, the sensation of being watched by something that didn't care for my existence, something ancient and cold. My mind raced. The rules had always been clear, had always kept me grounded. But now, I wasn't sure I could keep following them. I glanced back at the door. The team had moved back toward the main area of the factory. They were trying to stay calm, trying to keep the chaos from breaking them. Mateo was no longer shouting, but I could hear the faint mumblings coming from his corner. He wasn't speaking English. Hell, it wasn't even a language I recognized. It sounded wrong. I moved toward him cautiously, keeping my eyes on the shadows that flickered in the edges of my vision. Mateo was standing by the wall now, his back rigid, his arms held in front of him, fingers twitching in unnatural patterns. His shadow was twisting, curling around him like it was trying to break free from his control. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his forehead, but his eyes, they were wide, wild, and unseeing. He was somewhere else now, somewhere far beyond any kind of help I could offer. "Mateo," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to wake him. His head snapped toward me, his mouth falling open, but no sound came out. Instead, his shadow shifted again, detached, and seemed to slither off the ground, inching toward the door as though it had a mind of its own. I stepped back. Something wasn't right. What do I do? I couldn't leave him behind. But staying to help him was a mistake too. The visitors were everywhere, their forms flickering in and out of view, their low hums getting louder, vibrating through the walls, through my bones. "Don't leave me," Mateo whispered, his voice hoarse and distant. His eyes were pleading, but his body was becoming more alien by the second. I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. I had to make a choice. Stick to the rules and leave him to whatever fate the visitors had in store. Or break them, take a chance, and risk everything. I couldn't breathe. I had to move. I turned away, unable to look at him anymore, but as I did, something caught my eye. The visitors were surrounding the factory. More of them now. They hadn't followed us inside, but they were waiting, watching, just outside the walls. They'd blocked off our exit, the truck. We couldn't leave. "What the hell do we do now?" Erin asked, her voice thin with fear. She was gripping the box still, her knuckles white. "We can't get out," Carter muttered, looking around at the windows that were filled with dark figures. I ran my hands through my hair, heart pounding. There had to be something. Some way out. I glanced over at the wall behind me and froze. There, etched into the crumbling brick, almost hidden in the shadows, was a symbol. It was simple, a series of intersecting lines, but there was something about it, something that felt protective, almost like a ward. I stepped closer, cautiously, eyes scanning the visitors. They weren't getting any closer, but they weren't backing off either. "What's that?" Erin whispered, but I didn't answer her. The symbol. It was familiar. No, not familiar. It was important. I looked down at the box. The glowing mass inside pulsed, as if reacting to the symbol. "No," I whispered to myself. "It can't be. The box, the thing inside it, it wasn't just some artifact. It was reacting to the symbol. But why? I didn't have time to think about it. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed the box from Erin's hands and rushed to the symbol on the wall, pressing the glowing mass into it. The air vibrated. At first, I thought it was the hum of the visitors growing louder. But no, it was something else. A crackling, a pulse of energy that shot out from the glowing mass and spread across the symbol, lighting it up like a living thing. The visitors hesitated. I stepped back, my heart racing. This wasn't the same hum. It wasn't the same feeling. Whatever power was in that box was pushing them back. I didn't know how, and I didn't know why, but it was happening. The visitors stepped back, flickering and glitching in the air, their figures becoming more distorted. They didn't vanish, but they moved away from the wall, as if they couldn't cross that barrier. "We need to get out," Carter said, his voice urgent. But I hesitated, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. By using the box, I'd activated something. Something that felt wrong. But I had no choice. Go, I said, looking around at the others. I'll cover you. Carter didn't wait. He bolted toward the truck, Aaron following behind. Mateo, though. He stayed behind. His shadow had finally broken free, fully detached from his body now. It was skittering across the floor, creeping toward the exit. Mateo, I shouted, but he didn't hear me. His shadow turned toward him, stretching out, curling like it had a life of its own. The last piece of him that was still human stepped away. I took a deep breath and followed my team. The visitors were still watching us, but the symbol had held them back, for now. I just hoped it would be enough. The visitors were gone as quickly as they had come. 1 minute, the factory was alive with their flickering, shifting forms, and the next, nothing. The air was still, the low hum gone, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. I could almost feel the weight of their absence pressing down on me, like the world had snapped back into place too suddenly. The residual energy from their presence lingered, though, like static cling, but in my bones, in my skin. A cold sweat ran down my spine as I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But Mateo was worse than before. He was still standing by the wall, his eyes wide, but now they were blank, unfocused. His shadow was no longer a twisted, independent thing. It seemed to have sunk back into his body, but something was off. It no longer looked like his shadow. It looked like it belonged to something else entirely. He didn't speak, didn't react to the others as they rushed past him toward the exit. He only blinked slowly and then, as if on cue, began following us. No words, no emotion, just movement. Mateo, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but he didn't even turn his head. We managed to make it back to the truck, but as I looked around at my team, Aaron, Carter, even Mateo, there was something wrong with all of us now. Something that had changed in the core of who we were. We were survivors, but at what cost? The drive back was a blur. I was too caught up in my own head to pay attention to the roads, to the passing lights. The factory, the visitors, Mateo's new emptiness, none of it felt real. But it was. And the price of this knowledge was heavier than anything I had expected. When we pulled back into the warehouse, the usual humdrum of unloading the truck felt wrong. The air in the warehouse felt different, thick with something I couldn't name. Waiting for us at the back door were 2 corporate representatives, tall, with expressions as cold and blank as Mateo's. Everyone out of the truck, one of them said, her voice firm, unyielding. Carter stepped forward, his posture rigid. We're done here. Not yet, the woman replied, her eyes scanning over the truck, over each of us. We have some business to discuss. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. I didn't need to ask what kind of business they meant. They began to pull everything from the truck, every object, every piece of junk, and they went through it with precision, cataloging, scanning, inspecting. They took photos and made notes, all while barely sparing us a glance. No evidence of tampering, the man said finally when he'd finished. I hadn't even realized I was holding my breath. Good, the woman replied. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folder, passing it to Carter. He flipped through it without even glancing at the papers. He already knew. A warning, she said, her voice flat. We know what you've done. We know what you've seen. You will comply. If you don't, the consequences are not negotiable. I swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on me. There was more to this than just the company. There was something else lurking beneath the surface, something far darker and more dangerous. You've been monitored the entire time, the man added, his voice like a velvet glove over steel. From the moment you signed on, we've known everything you've done, everything you've seen. My stomach dropped, and I suddenly felt like I was suffocating. How long had they been watching us? How long had they been aware of everything that had happened? Had they always known about the visitors? About the boxes? About the tethering? Understand this, the woman continued. You are part of a system. A necessary system. You are maintaining a barrier, and when the time comes you will comply, or else. There was no more need for words. They didn't say it, but it hung in the air. Failure to follow the rules meant something far worse than just losing your job. It meant losing everything. I felt the room spinning around me, the weight of everything crashing down. We weren't cleaning up junk. We weren't just doing a job. We were standing guard over something far older, far more dangerous. And we were complicit in it. When they left, taking all the evidence with them, I knew something inside me had shifted. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't just ignore what I had learned. The factory wasn't a freak accident, it was planned. And the visitors, the beings, they were no mistake either. We weren't cleaning up junk, we were keeping a fragile balance in place, and once we broke it, the consequences were catastrophic. I went to my locker, my mind racing. I needed space, some kind of clarity. But when I opened it, I stopped cold. There, nestled among the other contents, was a small, glowing fragment of the mass. It pulsed faintly, glowing in the dim light of the warehouse, as if alive. I couldn't breathe. It had followed me. The hum started again, distant at first. I could hear it, a low vibration in the back of my skull. It was coming from outside. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. I was already too far gone. The hum wasn't just in my head. It was real. And it was getting closer.